pues es una persona con... ¿Ahí? Ok, gracias, Víctor. ¿No lo estamos transmitiendo ya? ¿Otra vez? Vamos a leer una breve semblanza de nuestro invitado de honor, quien, como comentaba, es una persona que seguramente no requiere presentación porque pues es uno de los autores, yo creo, más multicitados en la actualidad sobre temas de gobernanza y una referencia importante seguramente para todos los y las colegas que nos acompañan en el día de hoy. Mark Bevere es profesor distinguido de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Es autor de libros como Una teoría de la gobernanza y también de la gobernanza democrática. Y su línea de investigación principal actualmente es el multiculturalismo y la salud pública. Thank you, Mark. And go.
Well, let me begin by saying thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've been to the... Let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me. It's the first time I've been to the Yucatan, or to Mexico for that matter, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Before I begin my talk, can I just ask, how do I get the slides to move forward? Do I just signal to you that I want to use? Good, thank you, gracias. So the slide you have up here is really a summary of the whole talk. I won't spend long on it. It's just so that while I'm chatting away, you can read it and see where the talk is likely to go. What you really have is a plot for telling an account of how governance arises. So I think there's something that I'm going to call developmental historicism, which dominates the 19th century. That is replaced by modernism in the early 20th century. I've distinguished two different epochs of modernism. The first is called government, and that is what I think existed until roughly 1979. Because I'm British, 1979 is an important date. It's when Margaret Thatcher was elected. So when I say 1979, you should think that that is code for the rise of neoliberalism, right? So I think government exists until really the late 70s and the rise of neoliberalism. And at that point, we switch to something that we might call governance or the new governance. And you can see that I've distinguished various characteristics of both developmental historicism and government and the new governance. I've distinguished the sort of rationality that I think characterizes them. I've described the sort of state that I think is generally associated with them. I've talked about the role of the public sector in them, and I've talked about the mode of accountability in them. Some of these things will appear later in the talk. I will focus mainly on the concept of rationality and on the nature of the state. I will say less about the public sector and the mode of accountability, but they're on the slide, so you can familiarize yourself with roughly what I'm talking about. The one thing I really want to stress about the slide, this is going to be, I think, the most important aspect in a way of the talk, is that for me, the key dividing line appears between developmental historicism and modernism. You'll notice there's a strong line that goes all the way down the table there. It does not appear between government and the new governance. Right? What that means is that I'm really associating in a longer history what some people think is very, very new, the new governance. I'm associating it much more tightly with government and saying both are expressions of something we could call modernism. And together they contrast with what existed before them. Right? So I'm not drawing a sharper link, as most people would, between government and governance. Instead, I'm saying, actually, they're quite similar. right? How and why I think that will become clearer as the talk moves on. But that's the key point I want to make at the moment, is that as the talk progresses, I want to stress that both government and governance express modernism. And by modernism, again, I will say more about this in the talk as it goes on. What I really mean is modernist ways of thinking about the world. Modernist ideas, modernist forms of knowledge. We probably have a loose idea of what that means, or you probably have a loose idea of what that means already. If you talk about modernist art, it's more fractured, it's less rooted in a historical context, it's more formal, it's more abstract, right? All of those characteristics of modernism, I think, are also apparent in a shift in the social sciences. And I think that shift is the key change in 19th century onwards government, right? I think that shift, the shift towards that sort of fragmented, ahistorical, formal, abstract form of knowledge is the key shift. And compared to that shift, I think the shift from government to governance is slighter and less important. So I've already been talking really about what this slide is showing you. I'll now make a couple of things explicit. The first is that I'm defining governance in a way that is arguably fairly standard. There are lots of ways we might define governance, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm defining governance as the apparent decline of bureaucracy within the state and the rise of markets, contracting out, the new public management, networks, joined up governance, whole of governance approaches, and so on. Right? I'm not averse to defining governance in other ways. It's just that's how I'm defining it today. I don't think much is at stake, but that's what, so I'm talking, in other words, if we don't like the word governance, I'm talking about changes in the state. I'm trying to say, how do we explain changes in the state since the late 70s? For me, and some of you, that's really the changes in my lifetime. Right? So what I'm really interested in, how has the world changed while I've been alive? When I was born and growing up, Britain was a largely bureaucratic state with a large welfare state component, with government control over the demand side of the economy, and where the state itself delivered most public services. Not just National Health Service, not just education, but it cleaned its own offices. If I was in Britain now, I would say, I think this room we're in is probably now cleaned by a private sector agency, which the university contracts the cleaning out to. When I was a student at university, it wasn't. The room was cleaned by employees of the university. So even in our own academic world, this shift has happened. The world, for those of you who are much younger than me, it's hard to explain how dramatic that change is. I mean, it's the whole governmental structures in which I grew up have been dismantled, or at least people have tried to dismantle them. I think we can overstress the extent to which this has happened. And there's a whole new form of the state has arisen, a more disparate form of the state, a more disaggregated form of the state, a state that works with private sector actors and voluntary sector actors, a state which struggles to coordinate all these different actors to deliver effective services. And what interests me is, how do we explain that shift? What happened? Why has the state changed like this in my lifetime? And I just am using the word governance to capture that change. Right? So I'm not saying much particularly interesting or novel about what governance is in this talk. Maybe right at the end, but not much. What I think I'm doing, though, is telling a very different story about it. Right? I think the story I will tell about the change is radically different from any other story I've ever heard. I don't want to go back a slide, but in a way I've already shown why. Most of the stories we hear about that change talk about the drama of the shift from government to governance. That's what I've just done. I've talked about the drama of the way the state has changed in my lifetime. In contrast, when I reflect on it academically, the story I want to tell is one of the continuing dominance of modernism in contrast to earlier forms of knowledge. Right? And that story, the story in which modernism continues and persists and dominates our life, is not the way in which we are normally told to make sense of changes in the state. So I think I have a fairly conventional account of what governance is, but a very unusual account of how and why it has arisen. Okay, so what I want to say about how governance has arisen, forward. Perfect. What I want to say about how governance has arisen is that it has arisen in two waves. Actually, can we go back a slide? Graphics. So I want to say it's arisen in two waves. So first, there was developmental historicism, which predates modernism. This dominates the 19th century. I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that in a moment. And then that is replaced by a form of modernism. Modernism has two characteristics. One strand of modernism instantiates an economic concept of rationality, the other a sociological concept of rationality. Right? And I'm going to talk about governance as having a first wave, which is associated with the economic concept of rationality, and a second wave, which is associated with the sociological concept of rationality. So by developmental historicism, what I really mean is that people make sense of the world by telling historical narratives of it. This is something that I think dominated the 19th century. People believed there were facts, and they tried to recover the facts, but they made sense of the facts by locating them in a historical story. Typically, the main historical story was the story of the development of a nation state. So facts about British government were told in the context of a history of Britain. Facts about Mexican government were told in the context of histories about Mexico. Sometimes, indeed, I would say normally, those national narratives were understood to be part of a broader universal narrative. Right? And the universal narrative was a narrative about the way in which all peoples and all states develop, typically progressing towards a fairly Western ideal of freedom and peoples in a nation who are governing themselves. If you think for a moment about those sorts of narratives, you find them in Hegel, Marx, slightly altered because of the revolutionary nature, John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, any of the main 19th century social or political theorists you could think of is really telling a narrative of that sort. They're recovering facts, but then they're locating them in that sort of a historical narrative. That developmental historicism dies. We can talk about why it dies and why it declines. There are complex reasons, but probably the simplest way of explaining its decline is to say it declined because of World War I. So most of those narratives told a story of progress towards liberty, reason, and a rational end. Right? Again, think of Hegel, think of Mill and his idea that all states are developing along the same line, Spencer, Comte, and the movement towards technological rationality. They're all progressive and rational. The problem they face then is how on earth you incorporate World War I into a story of progress and rationality. For most Europeans, that would look like a sick joke. Right? So progress and rationality become untenable. And that means historicism as a way of narrating the world starts to look untenable too. So in its place, there arises what I'm calling modernism. Because modernism does not look at history, it obviously instead has to look at more formal, abstract models or accounts of the world. It can't tell historical narratives. Instead, it has to locate its fact within abstract patterns and suggest that the pattern explains the particular fact. That sounds very vague, so I'll try and unpack it by the two concepts of rationality I have there. One way of moving towards a more formal, abstract form of knowledge is what we find in modern economics. So there, what you get is certain postulates of human behavior. that humans are rational, self-interested actors. And those postulates are used to build formal models. For most social scientists, we see that in rational choice theory. But it's also what happens in much of neoclassical economics, where the same postulates are used to build an, I would say, ideal model of how exchange works, how prices are formed, how supply meets demand to govern prices, how government intervention might or might not affect various stores. All of these are based on abstract deductions from the principles. So economic modernism tends to be quite deductive, right? It starts from postulates and then it deduces models from those postulates. You can see there's no history involved in that, right? You can walk around many departments of economics today and there's no need to study history. Right? There's very little that goes on in economics departments today that looks like history, including even the history of economic thought, because it's irrelevant to understanding contemporary economics. The second sort of modernism is sociological modernism. It's in a way more inductive in that it's looking at the world to establish facts, but when it finds the facts, instead of making sense of them by deducing, instead of making sense of the facts by telling a historical story about them, what it does is to fit them into an abstract pattern. There are two main types of abstract pattern that sociological modernism offers. The first is that it offers up a formal norm or rule that allegedly governs the structure. So much historical institutionalism today argues that institutions are characterized by norms, whether those are formal and written or whether they're informal shared understandings, which govern the behavior of actors within the institution. So again, there's no history. You could, if you wanted, tell a history of the norm, but there's no need to do so. Instead, you can just appeal to the abstract norm, and that defines the behavior. So the institution is understood in terms of these abstract patterns of norms. Right? The second way in which sociological institutionalism can develop is through a more functionalist form of explanation. So then sociological modernists, I guess, sociological modernists would say that the fact they found is explained by the way in which it or something serves a function within the institution. For instance, the way in which the executive branch of government serves the function of making a decision. So allegedly, all forms of government need to make decisions. The executive, therefore, is merely fulfilling a necessary function. And so if you think, again, I hope this will sound familiar, if you think about sociology today, most sociology departments are driven either by, there are outliers of ethnographic studies, but the dominant strands of sociology and of political science and of public administration and of public organization theory and of every other social science you like to mention, apart from economics, in all of those, the main forms of explanation are either an institutionalism that reifies norms and rules, or an appeal to things like functions and systems. Right? So we have these two forms of modernism. They arise in the early 20th century. Technically, neoclassical economics arises in the 1880s, but it becomes dominant as you move into the early 20th century. Sociological modernism is obviously associated with Weber, who introduces the idea of formal norms and rules, and with Durkheim, who introduces the idea of systems and functions. And again, both are late 19th century, early 20th century thinkers. So there's this really radical shift in the nature of social knowledge from the 19th century to the 20th century, which we don't talk about much. And it's a shift from developmental historicism to modernism. And I think that form of knowledge, economic rationality and sociological rationality, I think they persist right up to today. Notice how easily I've been able to try and get you to recognize what I'm calling modernism by drawing attention to what happens in contemporary social science departments. Right? I haven't had to, apart from when I just name-checked Weber and Durkheim, I haven't had to refer to thinkers of the early 20th century. I've said, this is what goes on in modern economics departments. This is what goes on in other social science departments. We live in a world that's still dominated by modernism. Right? So again, this decisive shift is from developmental historicism to modernism. So how's that going to help us understand the crisis of the state? Well, I think that what happens with modernism is that initially, modernist expertise is housed within the state. So very, very crudely, the state relies on economic forms of rationality to define its economic policies, particularly Keynesianism. Right? Keynesianism is an in-house form of economic expertise that tells the state how to go about managing the economy. It relies on sociological forms of modernism in all its welfare departments. So sociological modernists will tell it who's likely to be poor, why, how you can best treat them, how to structure a bureaucracy, how to make the state work better, and the state houses that form of expertise. So for much of the 20th century, what we have is a state that's expanding as more and more public servants and professionals come in with a background in modernist social science who tell the state how to operate. And the state sets up department after department after department that does this. I know that story is true of Mexico. There you go. It's not just a British talk. I know that's true in Mexico. That's what happens in Mexico, particularly after World War II, right? You get this slow and speeding up expansion of the state into more and more areas. You could almost date it back to the popular revolution in Mexico, when the state acquires some legitimacy and starts to take on more functions. Almost from that very moment, the state is drawing on technocratic experts with this sort of modernism to tell it what to do. What then happens in the 1970s, so now I'm turning to how we shift from government to governance. What happens in the 1970s is these forms of modernism turn on themselves. Instead of being forms of knowledge that tell the state how to act, they become forms of knowledge that offer critiques of the state, right? So most obviously, neoclassical economics and rational choice theory stops saying, this is how you, the state, can govern the economy, and it starts to say, state institutions bad, market institutions good. Right? So what happens, the shift from government to governance, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about this, happens because modernist forms of knowledge, instead of being things that are telling the state how to act, become things that suddenly are being critical of the state. The same forms of rationality are instantiated, but now they're used to offer critiques of the state rather than to support state action. So the first wave of governance happens as economic rationality turns on the state, offers critiques of the state and proposes different solutions. So I'm talking here about neoclassical economics and rational choice theory. And the neoliberal narrative draws on these forms of knowledge to explain why, or to tell us why the state is inherently inefficient and why markets are good. Right? So it says, for instance, that markets enshrine competition and competition promotes efficiencies, and the state does not do so, so therefore the state is inefficient. These sorts of narratives lead to accounts of things like the overloaded state, where because the state is inefficient, the more of a nation's economy is given over to state activity, the less room there is for growth. So therefore, as the state expands, you get less and less growth, right? So that's one form of the critique. You also get critiques in which rational choice theorists start to say everyone is self-interested. That includes bureaucrats. So bureaucrats go in for things like bureau shaping and trying to increase their own power rather than promoting the general good. So instead of trusting civil servants to go out and promote a general good and to govern the world well, we should be suspicious of them and seeing them all as pursuing their own self-interest. I'm ashamed to say I do that. It's quite interesting. I'm obviously in most of this talk going to be being critical of modernism, but it's astonishing how much I share some of these modernist ideas that undermine the world I grew up in. I am suspicious of politicians. I am suspicious of bureaucrats. I do see them all as self-interested actors, but that's not a natural thing to do. For most of history, people have not seen politicians like that. For most of history, people have seen politicians as embodying a national collective good and working to pursue it. Again, think of Mexicans during the Popular Revolution. That's how most Mexicans would have seen their state at the time. What happens is we are captives of these new forms of knowledge. So we internalize this suspicion, right? So the neoliberal narrative offers us this new way of being suspicious. And out of the neoliberal narrative, then, you get a range of reforms that try to diminish the role of the state, replace it by markets, and curb the self-interest of state actors. These include marketization, contracting out, and the new public management. I don't want to say too much about that because it's a fairly familiar story. The only thing I want to stress is at the bottom of the slide is that I think there's a sense in which, particularly for the organization of the state, the key here is principal agent theory. Right? The key here is principal agent theory. It's not a more generic form of neoclassical economics. Principal agent theory, moreover, firstly, note, just like the suspicion of that people will be self-interested, it's not a natural way of thinking. It's a specific social science theory that arises in the 1930s. And it arises to discuss the private sector, where there's a separation of ownership, that is the shareholders, and control, that is the managers. Indeed, we can be more specific. That's an account of American and to a lesser extent British capitalism that does not really apply to the rest of the world. So principal agent theory arises as a theory of Anglo-American capitalism. Right? But from there, it colonizes everything. Right? And by the 1970s, late 60s, public administration scholars are using principal agent theory to say that something similar is going on in the public sector. Their ownership is what? It's possibly we, the citizens, it's possibly the politicians. We're the owners, we're the people for whom this should be, the public services should be operated, but the public services are controlled by the bureaucrats who have their own agendas. So how are you going to discipline these bureaucrats? How are you going to make sure that they pursue the interests of we, the people, or our elected representatives rather than themselves? And the answer is that they roll out exactly those policies which had already been introduced in the private sector to try and deal with problems of corporate governance. So you already had in the private sector things like pay in relation to profits, new budgetary techniques, new forms of organization. And all of those were meant to control executives within the private sector, and they're introduced wholesale into the public sector to try and curb bureaucrats. I should say that these stories of mine are not just stories. I can actually track the ideas through the advisors. So in the case of the new public management, one of the first forms of the new public management to be introduced in the world was introduced in New Zealand. And the main policy maker there, civil servant behind the scenes, has moved in and out of academia. And I can't remember his name, but I can look it up and email it to you. Soon after he introduced the reforms, he had a sabbatical year in the UK where he wrote an article for Public Administration, the journal. And in the article, he quite specifically says that what distinguishes the New Zealand reforms from earlier reforms is that it's not just about introducing markets. It's specifically rooted in principal agent theory and an attempt to extend that. So you can actually track through individuals. And now I want to move on to the second wave of reforms. And this I think is more controversial. So once when I've given this exact talk, someone in the audience who will forever remain nameless said to me that, of course, neoliberalism was bad and we all knew that it was tied to neoclassical economics. But what I was attacking in this slide, the new institutionalism, that was just plain good social science. To counter that view, I want you to note in advance that the story I'm going to tell here is identical to the story I've just told. It's a story about a specific contingent form of knowledge turning on the state, taking it over, transforming the world we live and governing our activities on a daily basis. So here I'm talking about the new institutionalism. And the new institutionalism, I'm going to skip the functionalist stuff and focus on institutionalism. The new institutionalism inspires a social democratic narrative. Within the academy, the new institutionalism arises largely as an attempt to fend off the challenge of rational choice theory. So old-style social scientists, as we saw earlier, were indebted to Weber and Durkheim. They were found in sociology departments, schools of public administration and policy. They were important people. They advised governments. Someone yesterday evening who's in the audience was saying how when they were doing a PhD, number 10 Downing Street and the Prime Minister rang up their supervisor because their supervisor was an important person, right? So these people were important. And then suddenly in the 1970s, they weren't important. And their knowledge was unimportant. And everyone wanted to hear from economists and business schools, and they had no time for sociologists and political scientists and public administration professionals. So all these other social scientists needed a way of fending off rational choice theory and neoclassical economics. And the way they did that was to say that actors are not rational actors. They're embedded in social cultural institutions, which gives them norms, ways of behaving, which lead them to behave as required by the norm rather than straightforwardly rationally, right? So the new institutionalists define their institutionalism in this way. Do you know why they're called the new institutionalists? This is just so ironic. Because after they've carved out this form of institutionalism by saying, no, actors aren't rational, they behave within institutional contexts, they discovered that rational choice theorists were already telling stories about institutions, and that rational choice theorists called what they were doing the new institutionalism. So then, in the late 90s, early 2000s, all the social scientists had to distinguish their new institutionalism from the new institutionalism of the rational choice theorists. And that's why we live in a world where there are all these different new institutionalisms. And you get endless articles discussing their differences: historical institutionalism, sociological institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, because the social scientists who thought they were doing the new institutionalism needed to distinguish themselves from rational choice institutions. Anyway, so we've got the new institutionalism out. It should be, as soon as I say it, it should be obvious that the new institutionalism is a great, great, great narrative, not just for those academics, but also for social democratic governments. Because social democratic governments can say neoliberalism is wrong, because it ignores the fact that humans are embedded. It ignores their embeddedness within institutions and cultures. That's why neoliberalism is wrong. We need to recognize that we are social actors, and we, the social democrats, do that. So we are not neoliberals. But our institutionalism is new. It's not the old institutionalism of socialist governments in the post-war era, because that's dated, that's been overturned by neoliberalism. What we are is something new that updates institutionalism in order to make it workable within the modern contemporary world, right? That emphasis on newness and overturning things takes two forms. One form, which in my universe was particularly common in America, because America's particularly evil in its social science, believes that this new institutionalism has always been correct. It's just that now they've discovered it, right? So for the new institutionalists in America, the new institutionalism is permanently correct. And now they, the great social scientists, have discovered it for us. They have discovered the secret of embeddedness and norms and rules within institutions. Amongst some left-wing thinkers outside America, It takes a slightly different form because of the legacy of Marxist thinking. So for many other social scientists who are influenced by Marxism, the argument's a bit different. The argument is that the old institutionalism used to be pretty good. Because it was quite suited to Fordist circumstances. But now capitalism has changed and we live in a post-Fordist universe. And in the post-Fordist universe, we need new ways of thinking and new ways of governing. And in that world, the new institutionalism and the things it sponsors is great. So there are two slightly different narratives about why past social democracy failed and where we need to go. For American-style institutionalists, the failure of old-style social democracy was inevitable, bound to happen, and now they've got the key to success. For thinkers more influenced by Marxism, there's more a sense of the old social democracy created a temporary stability within capitalism associated with Fordism and the welfare state, but that has been eroded because you can't mask capitalist crises forever. And now we need to establish a new post-Fordist form of equilibrium, and that's going to be the new institutionalism. Okay, so how does this work? Well, part of what's happening is the emphasis on new institutionalism is taking us away from fixed bureaucracies, which would be the old institutionalism, and instead advocating more informal and more flexible modes of organisation, which are what? Networks, partnerships, collaborative governance, joined up governance, whatever you want to bung in there. There are so many buzzwords, I wouldn't know where to begin. But what I want to do here is talk again about a specific policy area, kind of idea, specific people, to get you this sense of how these ideas move from academia into public policy. So the policy idea I want to talk about is wicked problems, which aren't wicked as in evil, they're wicked as in particularly intractable. So this idea arises in the 1970s in planning theory. And the idea is that some problems are particularly difficult to solve. And typically, wicked problems are characterized as problems that cut across departmental silos. So the state is seen as being made up of departments, and each department forms a silo. And wicked problems are things that cut across those silos. So let's come up with a good example. The example I sometimes use is of school children playing truant from school. Right? No, let's have school children who are vandalizing a parking lot or vandalizing a shopping centre. So that looks like a law and order problem. But then you say, but the school children are doing that because they're missing school. They're skipping out of school to be vandals. So then it starts to look like an education problem. But then you discover that the reason they're missing school is that their parents aren't taking them to school because their parents are whizzing off to work or whatever. So then it looks like a family welfare-like problem. So it's a problem that no agency can solve on its own. The police can't solve it because it's tied to education, but the education people can't solve it because it's tied to family welfare. But the family welfare people also, so where does this problem lie? Right? And that's probably the main way in which wicked problems are defined. They have this cross-departmental basis. It's quite interesting. I have all these things that interest me. It's quite interesting to me that this idea arises really early because we're inclined to think that critiques of the state arise from the right with neoliberals, but often they don't. Often they arise on the left. And this is a left-wing critique of the bureaucratic state. And it's saying the bureaucratic state is failing to solve issues of poverty, right? It's doing its best, it's well-intentioned, but these problems are really intractable and we're not doing a good job. And the data, I don't know about Mexico, but the data, at least in West European societies, strongly supported that in the late 60s and all through the 70s, that actually the welfare policies weren't really working as they were meant to do. Again, I'm old enough that there's a bit of me that is just stuck in socialist utopianism. And if any of you socialist utopianism resonates with you, you can imagine a world in which the welfare state was going to cure all these problems. It was going to effectively eliminate child poverty. Right? It was going to effectively provide an education system for all, which would overturn long entrenched imbalances and inequalities and create a more just society. And when I was born, you could still believe that. By the time I was 10, 15, you probably couldn't. You probably had to accept that in that sense, no matter how supportive you were of the welfare state, it had in a sense failed. It had failed to live up to its promise. And that's what this idea of wicked problems was trying to address. It was saying, why has the welfare state failed to live up to its problems? Well, so now we have these problems, and what they do is they cross departments. How are you going to solve that? I mean, it's just so obvious, isn't it? What you need is something that combines the different departments. You need a way of what? Joining them up. Hence, joined up governance. This is what joined up governance or whole of government means. It means you need to somehow join up these different agencies so that they can work together to tackle these peculiarly intractable problems. Right? So the idea of joined up governance is this, again, it's not a natural idea. The idea of network governance, not a natural idea. A network joins up organizations to address intractable problems. What these ideas are specific ideas of governance that arise to address a problem where that problem exists in the form it does because of how it's been theorized. So if you don't theorize the problem in terms of wicked problems, you don't see network governance or joined up governance or collaborative governance as a solution. Just like if you don't theorize the relationship between public servants and we the people in terms of principal agent theory, you don't see the new public management as a solution. You have to buy into a particular way of conceptualizing the problem in order to accept the solution. So the theoretical work being done by social science defines the problem in a way that then generates the solution. And we see that quite clearly here with the new institutionalism, where it defines a way of conceiving of a problem, wicked problems, that then generates a proposed solution, network governance, joined up governance, whole of government solution. Here, I've remembered to write down the name of the person I want to talk about. I've actually never met him, but I think from what I'm reading his work, I think he's a nice man who means well. And I say that because I don't want to seem to pick on him unfairly. But I am going to pick on him, obviously, because he's on my side. And this is someone called Perry Six, who's a British policy entrepreneur. And Perry Six, at the time, just before New Labour is elected, he's got one foot in academia. And in academia, he's an honorary fellow at the University of Strathclyde. And there he's collaborating with someone called Jerry Stoker, who I could also bring into my story, but I won't because one person is enough, on theoretical work on what they call a new Durkheimian institutionalism. So after what I've talked about, you should already know where that's coming from. Durkheimian, i.e. sociological functionalist rather than economics. So it's rooting itself explicitly with the word Durkheimian in sociological modernism. Institutionalism, again, the same thing. So within academia, he's part of the movement, albeit marginal, that's trying to create a new institutionalism that will theorize social action in a way that's different from rational choice theory, neoclassical economics. At the same time, Perry Six's main job is in with the think tank Demos. And for Demos, Perry Six is writing a series of pamphlets with titles like Holistic Governance, Housing, a Holistic Solution. Right? He's using the word holistic. And again, after I've walked you through it, you should now, when you hear holistic, think networked governance, joined up governance, whole of government agendas. So he's using the word holistic to capture the very idea of a networked or joined up solution to things like wicked problems. So he's got his foot, he's got new institutionalism as background, he's got this policy solution. And then when New Labour's elected, Perry Six and a range of his colleagues from Demos become key policy advisors. Perry Six writes some of New Labour's key white papers that define their policy agenda. Jeff Mulgan, who is his boss at Demos, becomes, I think he becomes head of the number 10, so prime ministerial policy unit, but I might be wrong about that, some sort of job like that. And other people like Mark Leonard and Daniel Stedman Jones from Demos also play roles. So you can actually, again, you can trace these ideas from where they've arisen in academia into policy. And I think that's quite important, because if I couldn't do that, I would just be pointing to patterns for you, right? Where there's a similarity between the ideas and the policies. But because you can trace those ideas into the formation of public policies, you can say something much more concrete, which is these ideas are generating, causing, producing the policy. Right? It's not just that we can spot similarities between neoliberalism and the new public management, or similarities between the new institutionalism and attempts to promote joined-up governance. You can actually track the way in which the social science ideas generate the policies. Okay. All right, so that's really the end of my account of the rise of governance. But I want very, very quickly, as far as I can do anything quickly, to say a bit about how this works out in practice. And I'm just going to do three very quick sketches. And in each of them, all I want to do is draw your attention to the way in which various social actors resist the attempt to impose either markets or networks on them. Resist, I like the word resist. So how they resist. So my first example is from a senior civil servant, Sir Richard Mottram. And Sir Richard Mottram says, when I was in defence, we had long since discovered joined-up government. It's presented as such a revolutionary idea, but I had worked for my whole career in defence on the basis that we joined up everything we did with the Foreign Office and with the Cabinet Office and with 10 Downing Street. It was just deep in our culture that this was the way you worked, and we got it off to a fine art. You're probably thinking, why would you call that resistance, Mark? So let me tell you. I would call that resistance because New Labour has just introduced what it thinks is an attempt to revolutionise the organisation of the state by promoting joined-up governance. And one of its most senior civil servants is saying, great idea, we already do that. You can see, I'm not saying he means to resist. It's an unintentional form of resistance. He's just automatically saying, yeah, great. And that just domesticates the reforms. It suggests you don't actually need to take them seriously or do that much about it. It's also worth saying, but I don't want to bang on about this, that embodies a Whig tradition within the British civil service. So you can understand why he's saying that. Next one. My second form of resistance, you've got to love this one. This is a police officer. I just love this one. Police officer interviewed about community policing or network policing. Command and control is situational. In my team, I don't have subordinates. I have team members. I invite their ideas and input and encourage them to talk to me. We all recognize that, presumably. That's what our deans tell us. That's what presidents of universities tell us. That's certainly what I'm told the whole time nowadays. But then notice the switch, and I can almost imagine the president. Sorry, I really can't. I don't want to be caught on camera saying anything like that. Now, of course I can. I can imagine the president of my university really thinking what I'm about to say, but not as much as a police officer. Then he goes on, however, as I said, it's situational. Terrorism is a good example. No, it isn't. How often is policing about dealing with terrorism? Really, really, really rarely. It's a very, very bad example because it's so far off from your main activities. Terrorism is a good example. As a commander in a crisis, when I want something done, it isn't up for negotiation. I tell the troops we have to rely on command and control in these situations. So again, clear resistance, because whenever the chips are down, he's going to adopt command and control rather than networks, teams, community policing. Let's just pause to note the sting in the tail. Police think everything is a crisis. So it's not as though when we're in a crisis and that happens once a year. It's when we're in a crisis and that happens every 10 minutes, then we need to revert to command and control. So no wonder community policing, networks, teams constantly gets pushed to the sidelines because they read it in terms of their tradition. And their tradition is command and control. Finally, No, one before that. So my final form of resistance is from citizens, and this is just a healthcare user, and I put it in because we're all skeptical citizens now, and this is a great example of a skeptical citizen. Patient is the traditional term, and I think it is still appropriate. The NHS, that's the National Health Service in the UK. The NHS is a service to users in the local community. I know consumer and customer, neoliberal reforms, imply choice, and that is what we are supposed to want. I would consider it an acceptable achievement if everyone could have what was best in the matter of treatment as a matter of right. There are certain cost considerations, but that is another issue. Choice may be a political ploy to take our eye off the ball and confuse us as to what really matters. Choice sounds like a good thing, but is it? You've got to love intelligent citizens, haven't you? But notice also how that would be a form of resistance, because if you can imagine that person, if market reforms are introduced in the healthcare, you can imagine them wanting to retain their traditional relationships with their doctor rather than pursue market efficiencies, right? So it's going to undermine the way markets operate. Next one. Okay, so finally, looks like I have 3 conclusions, but I actually have 4. And these are all really unimportant conclusions. And this is how I actually think the world has ended up being, right? Because mainly what I've talked about is how we got there, but social scientists like to know what I think the world looks like. So here's my answer. 1, I think bureaucracy still exists. Indeed, I think bureaucracy still remains the dominant mode of state action. And I would also add that I think that's a really good thing, right? Second, markets are resisted. Just been through an example of that with the healthcare officer. It would also be true. Virtually everywhere you look, people don't like markets. The only people that like markets being introduced into the public sector are the people who introduce them. Everyone else is resisting them. And finally, community networks are neglected. We saw that with the police officer as the biggest example, but you could also argue it's there in the senior civil servant. And it's because markets are resisted and community networks are neglected that bureaucracy remains dominant, in my opinion. Having said those are my 3 conclusions, the 4th conclusion, and this is the one that I think matters, I want to tell you why what I've just done is a critique. Why it's a critique of governance. Right? Not just a description or an account of it. And it's a critique in 2 respects, and I want to emphasize the second respect because I think that's key. So the first respect is it obviously is a genealogy. That's in the title of the talk. And in that sense, it denaturalizes governance. It shows how government's reforms, marketization, networking, aren't straightforwardly rational, aren't straightforwardly right. Instead, they are in some sense the contingent constructs of particular forms of knowledge which are at best contestable and arguably simply wrong. Right? So that's one way in which it's a critique. But there's a more profound way in which it's a critique. And this is why I think it was important to have those voices at the end, which is the voices at the end suggest that there's a sense in which the formalisms of modernism, whether it's about markets or it's about networks, whether it's based on economic rationality or sociological rationality, the formalisms of networks miss the ways in which people actually behave. And that means that the policies do not work out as intended. They are resisted or neglected. And that means that we live in a world of constant policy failure, where policies are meant to achieve something, but they don't because they're resisted or neglected. So my story is also a story of policy failure, and it suggests why we get that policy failure. And in doing so, it very, very, very loosely opens the door to a different way of thinking, which is if we're going to have more adequate policies, we need to pay more attention to the voices of the targets of those policies. We need to pay more attention to the voices of the senior civil servants, the beat officer policemen, and especially citizens. So we need a form of public policy that is more participatory, more dialogic, and less rooted in modernist social science. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Bevir, por tan importante y tan interesante conferencia y sobre todo este énfasis en la perspectiva histórica. Thank you very much, Mark, for such interesting presentation. It's very important to get this historical perspective. A continuación, vamos a tener los comentarios de el colega y maestro Carlos Chávez Becker. Next, we have the comments from Carlos Chávez. Carlos, muchísimas gracias también por estar presente aquí en Mérida y por haber movilizado toda esta gran aventura de planear las jornadas, junto con la doctora Eliana Arancibia, ambos coordinadores del grupo de trabajo Comexo. Voy a presentar brevemente a nuestro comentarista. El profesor Carlos Chávez es adscrito a la Universidad Autónoma de Metropolitana como profesor investigador en la unidad Lerma. También allí está inscrito en el Departamento de Procesos Sociales y es coordinador ejecutivo del Observatorio de Políticas y Prácticas Laborales en la misma universidad. Es candidato a doctor en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, maestro en Estudios Sociales y Políticos por la UNAM, y entre sus líneas de investigación principales están la gobernanza, la sociedad civil, la participación ciudadana, la acción colectiva y los procesos de democratización. Gracias y adelante, Carlos.
Muchas gracias, querida Eliana. ¿Sí se escucha bien ahí? Pues para mí es un gusto estar aquí, tal como lo han señalado, como lo comentaba el doctor Ricardo López Santillán. Ha sido un trabajo largo de más de un año, y llegar aquí pues me da mucho gusto porque todo el grupo de trabajo pues ha sido un proceso muy interesante y esta es, digamos, la parte final del trabajo durante 2005. Entonces, pues finalmente estamos aquí. También como señalaba el secretario académico, fueron muchos seminarios, muchas discusiones, y tuvimos la posibilidad de venir a Mérida, que siempre es un placer y un privilegio. Entonces, bueno, pues por todas esas razones estamos muy contentos. Y finalmente, bueno, también contar con la presencia de Mark Bevir presencialmente aquí en Mérida es un honor. Tal como lo señalabas, pues yo diría es uno de los gobernanzólogos más importantes en el mundo. Entonces, pues tener a Mark aquí, la verdad que es un privilegio y creo que ayuda mucho a cerrar el trabajo por este año. Mark, thank you very much for your conference. It has been super interesting, and as usual, we learned a lot listening to you. I will make a general comment using a little bit part of the other elements from your literature, but also I will try to connect some points to the debate that we have been having during our seminars in the working group on governance, and trying to I will try to re-understand part of Mexico's understanding of governance and using the idea of genealogy of governance in the case of Mexico. You started to do a couple of things with this process, but I will try to also contribute to that. So, social change in history, it's not a straight line. And development and the process of civilization is not a succession of phases or steps. I think in governance debate, this is particularly true. Usually, we understand and we see the development of the idea of governance and the idea of how governance was understood as a process of different steps, particularly in the second moment that you put it in your conference, within the debate of modernization. We usually understand these three models, one after the other. As I said, the usual understanding of the process of governance at the systemic level is the transit from the hierarchical state to the market state and to the network state. Here in Mexico, we have seen this process sometimes like this, but sometimes in a different transformation, from a moment in which government started to grow immensely, and when we created the institution of social protection, government started to grow a lot, and we felt and we experienced a very important model of centralization, hierarchic decisions, ruled by one party, by one political party, and sometimes the political party and government were the same, almost the same. So everything it was in a straight line, directed in a straight line, and any other opinion or any other way of understanding how the social problems could be solved in Mexico, it has been it was considered like enemies, like something out of the system. This process of transformation, then at the end of the last century, we started a process of transition to democracy, a process of pluralization, and everything started to change. I continue what I have in my notes. This process of transformation was accompanied by a transformation within government and the way in which government was studied. Also, this idea of sometimes we say the old public administration was followed up by the new public management, and then more recently we started to listen about the public policy narrative and design. The point is that also we saw that here in Mexico, and we saw that transformation. During the 90s, we started to see a lot of, we call it the technocracy, started to flood and to fill up the different levels of government, particularly at the federal government, with this idea of marketization and this idea of introducing more neoliberal or more market ideas within government and within public agencies. The interesting thing, and this is something that I clearly saw in your conference, the problem is that in reality we never live back entirely our past, and we never live entirely the elements, some elements of the past, the models from the past, and many elements are kept, but also are added to new trends. In this case, about systemic governance or system governance. It's interesting, for instance, if we think about the petroleum company that we have in Mexico, with its name, it's Pemex. It currently, it belongs to to the state. It's a public enterprise. During the first half and maybe until the 70s or the 80s, that enterprise grew up a lot. It becomes a massive, one of the most important petroleum companies, oil companies in the world. But they, for instance, after the 80s, they started to introduce a really different way of management within the company. So that changed a lot the narrative, a lot the understanding, the almost, I would say, the epistemology of governance of that company. But the shift, this change also had a lot of resistance. They faced a really strong resistance within the company. But at the end, they made a big reform. But now they are going backwards in that reform, and some elements from the first model of governance of the company are coming back to the model of governance. So we have seen this process in several public agencies and in several spaces of public life in Mexico. Here I can say that Spencer's concept of differentiation and complexity describes perfectly this process. Also, T.H. Marshall contributed a lot in giving sense to this idea, since he described the process in which institutions during 19th century and the beginning of 20th century experienced this process. So this process put us in a moment in which we live in an increasing, I can say, and this is also that I take from your conference, in a hybrid model, in which the old model or some elements or components from the old model of governance preserved, but we added with the neoliberal transformation, we added new elements, but with the network narrative, also new elements are added, and we are sometimes combining and sometimes like living in a moment in which we have an increasing complexity in the way in which governance is expressed in Mexico. So my final point is, this explains the need of a broader concept of governance. As Weber said, much time ago, governance is much more than government. And now we have, and we could see and experiment incredibly sophisticated new ways of governance also, which are added to the other models of governance that in some moments are present and are being experienced in social life in Mexico. Today we can see soft law in different spaces of international level, artificial intelligence and complex coalitions that are the only way we have to deal with also complex or wicked problems. And in these models also, and this is my final remark, these models were also open to more participative and deliberative forms of governance. And I keep one of your conclusions. The thing is that also in the times of networks, we lack asking citizens, connecting with citizens to understand exactly the thing, the needs and the expectations sometimes they have. And if we think that sometimes in some moment your conclusion, I felt it was kind of counterintuitive, because the current narrative is that you have to include people, that everybody is open to inclusiveness and to participate, and also that we have seen during field work is that people is also resisting sometimes to communitary governance or ways of participating within networks. So this is also something that we have to take into account, and I feel it will be useful to the new designs of future research in Mexico. So thank you very much, and I learned a lot, and I enjoyed a lot your conference, and thank you, Elena.
Muchas gracias, Maestro Carlos Chávez. Mar, would you like to add something about the comments of Carlos?
Thank you, Carlos. That's very good. So I have two broad responses. The first is about how the world looks, and I'm obviously not going to say anything specific about how Mexico looks, but I am going to comment on what you said. So I agree. I will slightly modify that agreement later, but for now, I agree that we live in a world where these sorts of reforms are, to use words you used, layered, hybrid, complexity. I think that's the world we live in. We live in a world where the reforms are layered on top of one another. The result is hybrid organizations. It's complex. Think of the kind of patterns I ended up with. So I completely agree with that. But I want to stress how I get to that position. So the way I get to seeing it as layered, hybrid, complex is through the latter bit of my talk, the bits on resistance. What I'm suggesting is that the policies don't work. They fail because they don't take account of the way in which people will behave. And that means that the patterns that arise are not those that the policymakers intend. They're not markets, they're not networks. Instead, they are, if we like, layered, hybrid, and particularly complex, right? But there's something about, therefore, how I get there, which is I'm saying this complexity arises not because of some sort of formal fact about the world, but rather the complexity arises because of the patterns of resistance. So if you want to see what's happened in the British police, you need to track the patterns of resistance that have happened there. If you want to see what's happened in, I don't know, the Mexican Treasury, you need to look at the patterns of resistance of the higher civil servants, probably also citizens, and perhaps even at some point street-level bureaucrats. Certainly that would be true, say, of water governance in the Yucatan, to pick something that we talked about yesterday, right? To see what's actually happening, you need to look at that. Or to understand the reaction of COVID, you can't just look at what the Mexican government intended. You have to look at the way in which COVID policies were enacted on the ground in disparate ways, thereby resisted or transformed. What that means is that to understand the complexity that we see, you're looking at patterns of resistance. And those patterns of resistance are intrinsically local because they embody local traditions. The way in which water governance develops in the Yucatan draws on Mayan traditions. The ways in which British senior civil servants resist joined-up governance draws on the traditions of the British senior civil service. So in other words, to understand the complexity, you need to look at the local traditions. The problem with words like complexity, hybridity, and layered, then, is that they tend to distract us from local patterns of resistance. They tend to suggest that there's some sort of commonality that's found in governance today wherever we look, apart from those intrinsic layer patterns. And what that means is that there are two ways we might think about words like layered, complexity, hybrid. One way is those terms are purely descriptive, and they describe to use another technical term, the mess that has arisen out of the way in which all sorts of people resist policies. Mess is a good word because it's really hard to colonize mess. You're about to see how important it is to come up with words that can't be colonized. So I will now stick with mess for what exists. So we live in a messy world. We live in a messy world that's made up of these resistance. And the role of words like complexity and hybrid is merely to remind us that the world is messy. But another way of using words like complexity and hybrid is to say, I, the social scientist, inspired by my modernist expertise, can offer you a model of complexity or hybridity. And that model explains the reality of the way in which the world is today. And that, of course, is a way of using the words that I would be deeply skeptical of, because it would instantiate exactly the form of modernism that I'm critical of. And there certainly are models out there of hybrid governance. And there certainly is a sociological theory called complexity theory. So you can already see how these words, which describe a reality, yeah, the world's messy, and we're just social scientists. We haven't got the keys to the universe. We're not God. I don't even believe there is a God. We're not natural scientists. We can't cut nature at the joints to find inevitable things. All we can do is go out and observe, describe what we see, describe the patterns we see, and tell stories about it. Right? But social scientists don't like to think they're restricted to that. And the forms of expertise they rely on them are ones where they turn words like messy, or more often hybrid or complexity, into yet more models, yet more forms of social science, which seem not just to describe, but also to explain. And then I'm hostile to those uses of the words. And that takes me to the idea of counterintuitive, because some of what I've just said, counterintuitive, the idea that what I'm doing is counterintuitive. So what I've just done, I think, does sound counterintuitive on one level. I think it's deeply and profoundly counterintuitive if you have got used to the language of modernist social science. And to some extent, we all have. As I said in my talk, we've all internalized suspicion of political actors as self-interested. So to some extent, everyone has internalized aspects of modern social science. But we, and by we, I mean the people in this room and people like us, we have really internalized it because it's what we do for a living. So to us, it sounds really, really counterintuitive. Think again of the colleague who said about the institutionalism, but that's just good social science. Right? What I'm saying to her is massively counterintuitive. I'm saying that the whole way of thinking that she has learned from age 18 to when she said this, she was in her late 40s, for 30 years of her life is a load of junk. I'm saying that whole way of thinking that you have internalized, professionalized, learned to think makes you a neutral expert, learned to think gives you expertise that you pass on to your students. It's garbage. Of course that's going to be counterintuitive. So in one sense, yes, what I'm saying is really counterintuitive. But in another sense, I think it's not counterintuitive at all. Because we all also live in the world. And in the world, we don't go around and we don't talk about ourselves as though our action is entirely self-interested or as though our action is governed by norms, right? We don't, when we say to a friend, I'll meet you in the bar at 5 p.m. We don't think, well, I need some sort of model of whether they're going to turn up or not, right? We just communicate and get on with life. We hopefully don't think, I mean, I'm sure there are people who do, but I hope most of us don't think of our loved ones, how can I maximize my benefits out of this relationship, right? So at some level, we're just not the actors that in our professional lives we imagine people are. And we all know that, right? We all know that. We all know that the concepts of modernist social science, which we've internalized so much, are actually merely simplifications that don't get near to the realities of our daily life, right? So there's a sense in which, although it sounds counterintuitive, what I'm actually doing is just reminding us of something that we all know really, really, really well. I'm saying, see it like this. See your profession, what you study professionally, see it as you would see your everyday activities with people. Stop seeing it through the lens of the formal languages you've been trained in. Just see it as it is, right? And that, when we see that that's all I'm saying, I don't think it's counterintuitive at all. I think it's reminding us of something we all know very, very well. And it's reminding us to resist the encroachment of modernist languages, modernist ways of thinking upon us, to resist the aspirations of formal theory. I don't want to go into this, but I will say it so that if anyone thinks, I really want to hear that, they can ask me afterwards. I actually think modernist social science is the last attempt of humans to create God. And I don't think it's an accident that it arises as the world becomes secular. Because a secular world, and I speak as an atheist, a secular world is a frightening world. It's a world that has no logic or patterns intrinsic into it, and certainly no goodness. It's a world in which we're struggling to make sense and get by. And what modernist social science does is offer us the illusion of control and expertise. Right? And what I would suggest is drop that illusion, learn to live without it, learn to just welcome what's around you, and then it won't seem counterintuitive.
Thank you so much. We have around 15 minutes more, or 10 minutes for question and answer. No sé si alguien de las personas que está aquí en la sala tenga alguna pregunta, algún comentario para nuestro conferencista. Dos, Cristina, son tres.
Well, thanks a lot for this really, really thought-provoking lecture. I think it was very, very interesting and challenging also at the same time. So I would like to ask you three things. The first one is, of course, modernism is like modernity on steroids, so to speak, because you have several ways or several models for modernity, but then we are working on this very extreme form of this belief that we can do things and we can change reality, or maybe we can control it through our knowledge and intelligence and rationality. But there are a lot of definitions of those. So maybe there are alternative versions of, I don't know if that's correct, softer forms of modernity that allow for greater variety to develop. So that's the first question. If you have an idea about how to, reconsider modernity in more sustainable ways. The second one is that, of course, everything depends on how we define the problem. And I usually, as Carlos was suggesting, I usually define governance in a wider sense, saying, okay, we live in a complex world, which of course now it's also very useful what you said. It means that we live in a world with a lot of conflicts, and then the resources in order to deal with those are very widely distributed. That's Koyman. Third, we need some forms of collaboration, but then Koyman says you have different varieties. It's not only networks, but you have a great variety of models. And finally, you need a government that is able to recognize that and adapt. So if you feed that very basic model with the wicked problems at the beginning in the diagnostics, then of course everything is going to turn out to be you need networks. And because of course if the world is not becoming more simple but rather more complicated according to this definition, people would say, okay, you need more medicine, so you need more networks and you need more markets and that sort of thing. So I do think, and I agree with Carlos, that we need a wider definition of governance. that allows for, and of course is what you already have argued in your publications, that allow for all these varieties. And I just love this idea of resistance defined as paying attention to community networks at the local level. Thanks a lot.
And next person, Cristina, another one.
Well, you already answered most of my questions, so I'll just say that most of your lecture was based on institutionalism and a new form of institutionalism more than governance. And I think that you see institutionalism as a way of survival, both for governments and for social theorists. And I would like you to dwell a little bit more on that. I mean, how institutionalism is not an explanation, but an explanation of a real world, but an explanation to keep government and social theory being important. And if I'm reading well what you said, that was one question. The other one was you speak of voices and you speak of agents. Are they the same thing? I mean, agent and voices. And how can you relate them in your whole explanation or your whole proposal, because it's not an explanation, it's a proposal.
And next.
Hi, Paola Suarez from Independent.
No.
Ahora sí. So I am a proud bear. I'm from Berkeley too. So I listened to you in the seminar that I was Kaddish Center.
Can you hold the mic?
In the there, and I listened to you, Mark. So I'm happy to see you again here. And in fact, my project of governance was inspired for your work. And now I want to ask you some questions about the contemporary democracy of US that we are in crisis in all America and US. And I have some questions because in the seminar we have this question: what happened when democracy in US are changing or decreasing, if we can see it, and means probably less governance, less important governance than in other times. Probably, I don't know. It's one of my hypotheses that probably in this second administration of Trump, we are not involved a lot with the governance as other times. For example, with Obama or Biden. The second one is, because my paper is about that, is how or why we can have trust in liberal, how we can trust in governance right now in liberal institutions in US. My cases of study, because I went in the third axis here in this group of governance, about cases of studies, is about, of course, Berkeley and Silicon Valley, and how you ruled the governance in this difficult context of the democracy of US, because of course in California you have another idea of democracy than Trump and other probably libertarians as Elon Musk. That is not the same thinking than in that Trump, but of course they have another idea also about the democracy. So if you can say to us something about that, because I think the trust is something difficult to figure out right now in the governance. Thank you, Mark.
Bueno, tal vez cortamos aquí tres preguntas y luego hacemos otra ronda. Another one.
Can I answer those ones?
Yes.
Okay, so, yeah, firstly, I'll have two comments on each question, I think, by the look of my notes. So firstly, on how to think about modernism or modernity. I think I think I'm trying to suggest that we should think about modernity more in terms of ways of knowing and less in terms of the rise of social or institutional things like capitalism, industry. But I think I would really want to stress that in a way we define concepts like modernity, these abstract patterns, pragmatically depending on the nature of our inquiry. So I don't want anyone to think that my definition is intrinsically correct. It's just a really good one for what I'm trying to do, right? So that's why I use it. And the other thing I would draw attention to, I probably should have said this earlier, is that there's a distinction between modernity and modernism. And modernity is often, and I think rightly, associated with something that arises in the late 18th, early 19th century. Capitalism, a more centralized state, more free markets, at least initially, the rise of industry. And I see that that's a modern world, the rise of popular journalism, the rise of political parties. I can see that's a world full of things I recognize around me that weren't there in medieval times, the Renaissance or the early modern era. So I think there's a role for something like that concept of modernity. And I think it's associated, if I was talking about ways of knowledge, with the Enlightenment and with Romanticism. And I think that's different from what we mean by modernism, which tends to be a term that only really exists when we're talking about the arts. And what I'm doing is trying to extend that term into other forms of knowledge and show how it affects similar patterns, fragmentation, abstraction, etc., appear in different ways of knowing and why they do so. And I stress World War I around that. Yes, and then so there was also a question about how we might make modernism more fruitful then. So this is my second response. And I think I do have an answer to that, which is I realize that I'm being critical of modern social science, and I really am. Right? I can't stress that enough. I'm being really critical of all of modernist social science. If you hear what I'm saying correctly, you realize I am eviscerating, as we might say, everything that my colleagues do. My colleagues don't dislike me because they don't hear what I'm saying properly, because they can't believe anyone would be saying things like this. And added to which, when they do hear it, they think it's unimportant. There's only one colleague in the whole of the Berkeley Political Science Department who does political science as I'm attacking it, who bothers to pay attention to what I'm saying and takes it seriously. But I really am undermining, I think, the whole way in which social science is done. And I think hopefully that was most clear when I was talking about it's particularly difficult for us. It sounds particularly counterintuitive for us because this is how we've been trained. But that doesn't mean that I totally reject it. What I'm asking us to do, I try to say this, is see it differently. See it as we see the way we do things in our everyday life. So within social science, these formal models, these formal abstractions, these appeal to norms, they're seen as things that, if you like, describe realities as though the institution really is like this, as though people really do behave like this. And you know that they're being treated like that because they're being relied on to do explanatory work, right? These things are being relied on to offer explanations. What I'm suggesting is we see them much more akin to loose heuristics. So by all means, if it helps you to work with the sense of there's a pattern of an institution like this, there's a pattern where people are often quite self-interested, particularly it looks to me in this sphere, then use that as a loose heuristic, right? But lose it as a loose, vague heuristic as we would use loose, vague heuristics in the rest of our life. So I have a loose heuristic. Here's one. When I travel, e.g. come here, I want to try and not forget things that I need to take with me. So I have a loose heuristic which goes like this: clothes, wash things, documents, work. It's just a heuristic, it's just 4 words, but it helps to guide me through what I'm doing. I don't think it's something that everyone's going to have. I don't think that is packing. That's what packing is. It's a model of packing. I don't elevate it as though somehow it's curing all problems. It's just a heuristic that most of the time helps me to remember things. Well, that's how we should treat the kind of formal knowledge that comes out of social science. It's just a heuristic. If you find it useful, if a policy advisor finds it useful to think in this way to understand what's going on, great. But don't imagine that what you're doing is somehow a uniquely correct story. It's just a useful tool for trying to navigate the world as best you can, right? So that what I would really think is we just on the one hand, I'm trying to totally overturn social science, but on another, what I'm really trying to do is just totally deflate it. Trying to say it's actually really insignificant, unimportant, that these knowledges are just more heuristics or more stories. They're not somehow getting at the world as it really is to give us some sort of superior expertise. Then on institutionalism, yeah, as I've just been suggesting, I obviously, on one level, I obviously really don't like institutionalism. And likewise, I don't want to make social theory important again. On the contrary, I think institutions don't exist. I really think that, right? I think we should have a moratorium on the word institution. No one should be allowed to use it for 20 years. Instead, they should have to use a word like practice, because institution is so corrupted by the sense that it embodies reified norms which define it, whereas practice suggests much more a loose, fluid activity which could be overturned. And I don't want social theory to remain important. On the contrary, I want it to become really unimportant and to be like an everyday heuristic. So there's a real sense in which I'm trying to undercut these things. I think that's true. And I should say that just as we might use institution, or as I would prefer, practice as a heuristic, so we can use rational choice theory as a heuristic. I actually think it's often in our daily life much more useful, and probably, this is the cynic in me, much more realistic to assume that people are, broadly speaking, trying to get something for themselves, rather than to imagine they're simply following a norm. Right? I might be wrong about that because maybe I'm just overly cynical, maybe that helps me to navigate the world better. But if I was to pick one of those two heuristics, I would go with the self-interested one. I do also think that's probably historical. I think there's something that worries me about rational choice theory, and this is going to come up in the Trump thing. So I'll say it now, but it's in a way answering the Trump question and trust. I seriously worry that the more we internalize the perspective of neoclassical economics and particularly rational choice theory, that everyone's self-interested actors, the more we internalize that, the more we become self-interested actors. So I really worry that economic modernism has a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy aspect about it that is deeply corrosive of communal life. Right? And I see that in myself. I don't know if you do. I probably shouldn't own up to this about myself. But I see my colleagues, here you go, everyone look around at someone who works next to you. Over the time, when I first arrived at Berkeley, I thought this is paradise on earth. And in a sense it is. It certainly was. It's gone downhill a bit, but it was just absolutely amazing. Absolutely fantastic. But over time, I've come to see this actor being self-interested. That's my heuristic. That one. I've come to see academia as full of people trying to promote their own careers, short-term loyalties to colleagues, you know, And of course, the more you interpret your colleagues in that light, the more you become like that, the more I've become like that myself, right? I probably shouldn't own up to this, but hopefully it resonates with some of you. And that shows how it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you interpret the world like this, you're in danger of responding like that. And when you respond like that, you make it more reasonable for other people to interpret the world like that. So I think there's something particularly pernicious about economic forms of modern thinking, because they encourage and promote a genuinely self-interested society, which, at least from my moral perspective, is really corrosive of a good society. And then quickly on voices and agency, I've never thought of that. I haven't got a clue how to answer it, so I might want to backtrack from this answer within 5 minutes. But I wrote down when you asked it that I think voices are an expression of agency. So I think the people are agents, and they're acting they're acting in accord with their subconscious, conscious beliefs, which are formed in their local tradition. And what you get in their voices is an expression of that agency, which you then have to interpret it. So you might interpret it as strategic action or rational choice action, right? I interpreted the senior civil servant as not realizing he was resisting, but maybe he did. Maybe this was a deliberate attempt to put up a barrier to the reforms to protect his fiefdom. I don't know, right? So you get a voice from an agent, and there's this gap between the voice and the reality of the agency, which always involves an interpretive act. And then Trump, I think I've tried to answer that a bit with the rational choice. I should say I know nothing about American politics. I make a conscious effort to know nothing about American politics, so that when a student rings me up and says, please, or sends me an email saying, please, will you comment on this? I can say, no. I know nothing about American politics. I'm British. Please contact one of the specialists in the department who works on American politics. So I officially know nothing about American politics. But my best guess is that Trump is drawing on, as far as I can see, Trump is at times definitely drawing in a way on different modes of governance. And some of them definitely look more authoritarian. And you can see that in some of the executive powers he's after, for instance, sending ICE agents into local communities to harass immigrants, right? That looks to me like but I can also see that as continuous with older forms of governance. So Biden and Obama in particular were the first ones to really use executive orders as governance tools. So if we pull back from the idea of what we might or might not think about the aims of the governance tool, there's a sense in which Trump is still using tools which were already there. And I suspect that in many ways, there's a lot more continuity than people would suggest in the basic tools of governance that Trump is using. And part of that goes with my cynicism and my belief in self-interested actors. And I think the Democrats are every bit as self-interested and political actors as is Trump, just aiming at a different base, aiming to get different things done. And a bit of me, I personally speaking, I wish the Democrats had won the election. Really, I wish the Greens had won the election, but that's a pipe dream. That's never going to happen. So in the real world, I wish the Democrats had won the election. But I can see why they lost. I think they're politically bankrupt. They've totally failed to offer a narrative that binds a community together and points to a way forward that appeals to a broad citizenship base. And instead they fractured into a rainbow coalition where they try to appeal to each of those different interests without suggesting what they're going to do when those interests conflict. And if it wasn't for Trump, I think they deserve, therefore, to be unelectable. And I say that as an expression of deep disillusionment with not only the American, but also the British left, which is the world I grew up in. And I think that even when they win elections, I think they now win elections because the right fails. And I think from the time of Blair, much as I disliked Blair, and the New Labour, as you should have heard in the network governance bit, at least then there was a left project that was actually trying to make the world a better place and telling us how it was going to make the world a better place for everyone. And you don't hear that from the left now. You don't hear a narrative of a shared good society. And then on trust, the only thing I have to say is it's difficult, but I think the problem, again, is not Trump. It is in part, but not really. The real problem is the extent to which we've all internalized the language of economic modernism. Therefore, we all read and hear everyone as self-interested actors. Therefore, we distrust everyone. That's obviously a polarizing statement. It's not true. As I said earlier, we don't treat our loved ones like that. There are spaces where we don't treat colleagues like that, particularly co-authors. Although, you know, don't tell any of my co-authors, but I sometimes treat them as and see what part of what they're doing as self-interested actors as well. So, you know, we've so internalized it. And that is so corrosive of the trust and the good society, which in a way go together. And I don't know how we get that back. I really don't. I really don't. Once you internalize this language, and we all do, right? We all do, I think, then I don't know how you lose that language and that lens, right? When you hear the groups that the Democrats now appeal to, when I hear a spokesman for that group, I hear a self-interested actor. I might share the vision of the good they're voicing, but I hear them as voicing a vision of the good that also expresses their self-interest. And so much, particularly on the left, is very good. People are very good at blending their personal interests with their career. I am an activist on behalf of X. Therefore, when I speak for X, I'm speaking for a good cause. But as an activist on behalf of X, I also benefit immensely from increasing the profile of X, right? So it's really hard to then disentangle it. And every time I hear it, I hear both. I hear that's a cause I can buy into, but I also hear self-interested actor. And I genuinely don't know what we do about that. I think we have a real problem, and I don't know that there's a solution. I think probably the nearest we can get to a solution is something I tried to gesture at the end of my talk, which is a way more dialogic and deliberative approach to policy making, where we engage people more, where we talk to them, and where we try and build a more empathetic understanding, so that even if we're interpreting them as self-interested, we're doing so in a space where we're empathetic to why, in their way of muddling through, these are the problems they face, and this is what's in their interest. And I want to stress there that if we're to do that, we need to do it for all sorts of groups that we might find unpleasant. So Trump needs to be empathetic for illegal immigrants, but we need to be empathetic for Trump. And we need to be empathetic to Trump supporters. And we need, instead of just demonizing them, to think, what is it that how do they see the world? How in seeing the world like that, does this look like something that they would want to do that serves their interests? And I think that's the only way we get out of this. I don't think we lose the sense that people are self-interested actors, but I think we can gain a sense in which we understand that self-interest not as something we demonize, but something we can empathize with given the life circumstances of the person involved. I think that's the nearest I have to a way out of it.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. De pronto una segunda ronda, pero muy rápida, por favor, porque ya estamos sobre el tiempo y ahorita nos vamos a la hora del café.
Sí, thank you, Mark, again for your lecture. It was very interesting, and thanks for all the discussion. Y gracias, Carlos, y gracias a todos por estar acá. I found very interesting that one of the most important words in your lecture was resistance, and you talked about patterns of resistance. And I find very interesting that the most important word, or one of the most important words in your lecture was, in a lecture about governance, was resistance. And I understood it from a point of view very similar to your criticism about the normative component of governance. And I think we can apply that to resistance, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood is like something like you can, or we can think about authoritarian forms of resistance or bad resistance to good governance, or good resistance to bad governance or bad forms of governance. So I think that's very interesting if you relate the resistance to governance in criticizing the normative component, and not only of governance but also of resistance. So, thank you.
Y una más, Carlos. Yamina también. Sí,
Hola Mark, hola colegas, qué gusto estar todos por acá. So I'm a lawyer, and which only means that I have a very different epistemic footing of governance. No? So in your interpretive approach, governance emerges from shared meanings among actors. So how might we incorporate law not as a set rules, as a situated practice within this interpretive approach? Thank you.
Hello. So thank you very much for your presentation. I really had a good time here. So I want to ask you, of course, from what I got from your conference is that there's sometimes, we live in a constant sort of policy failure because our policies are based on modern social scientific theories that don't really apply to our daily relations and interactions, right? So sometimes I agree with that. Of course, this broad conceptual frameworks of theories about human behavior don't really apply to what we really see. But at the same time, if we reject those models and we just take a closer look to what we really behave, we might realize that our behavior among individuals varies in a large scale. So I guess what I'm saying is that when we take away those models, we might see, or we might find patterns of behavior or patterns of resistance, as you say, but it might be that we don't find anything at all, because we might find that our behavior, is determined by social and cultural background, but not everyone in a society reacts or behaves in the same way to all the matters, or to every single matter. Like everyone might, or individuals might have a different reaction to a particular affair when it comes to education, health, or economic affairs, right? So if we see that amount of variation among individuals when it comes to their behavior, so when we take away those models, we might find ourselves with no control or understanding whatsoever about society. I think that's my worry. I don't know if I got what you, if I didn't understand completely what you were suggesting, but I guess my question is, although those models do not really apply to our social way of behaving, by taking them out of the equation, don't we risk having no knowledge whatsoever about society? Because there's so many different ways in which individuals behave when it comes to political, economic, social, and educational issues.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, so Resistance. Yes, there's definitely a sense in which particularly in the talk, I'm about to qualify this quite a lot, particularly in the talk rhetorically, resistance is something that good people do against bad policy or bad governance or bad social science, isn't it? And the people, I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, the citizen, it's really easy to see as a good person, I hope. But I also see the police in a way as good people in that sense, which is quite interesting for me. And it ties in, I think in quite a lot of these questions, I'm going to refer back to this sense of empathy when we understand people. I mean, I grew up, as I suggested earlier, in a good old British lefty way. And the police were fascists. That's how we thought about the police. And in studying them, I did become more empathetic of their situation and things. And although obviously the police officer's crazy on one level, I hope I'm not being totally unempathetic in the way I present the quote. Certainly if I talked about it a bit longer. This is their lived reality as a police officer, and it would be across most societies. And that means we can understand why they behave like they do and why they react like they do and why they're resisting bad governance, if you like. And the same's true of the senior civil servant, right? I mean, to me, these people are phenomenal elitists, senior civil servants in Britain. I think that might have got a bit less so, but it was certainly true when I was growing up. This was a really elite, clubbish world, and I had little empathy for it. But as you interview them and talk to them, and I hope again in the way I present the quote, that comes across. So there is definitely this sense of resistance as people reject, working against bad policy. But I'm going to own up and suggest that there's something slightly misleading about the way I use the word resistance, and that there's a bit of a conjuring trick in it. So what shall I say? Well, let's start by saying why I think, where the word comes from. As I just said, I'm from the background in British New Left thinking. And British New Left thinking always used the word resistance for what people, particularly citizens, but probably particularly workers, did to resist capitalism and capitalist ideologies. You find that word in the British New Left, particularly Stuart Hall, for those who know the literature, but probably also people like E.P. Thompson. Right? So that's where the word comes from. And I am drawing on that rhetorical power that it has. But I don't believe that stuff anymore. I don't believe that there is an entity capitalism. That's just another fiction of modern social science. Capitalism is a range of deeply varied and contested practices. I don't think it's an entity that structures the world and defines what goes on. So there's a little rhetorical trick that goes on when I use the word like that. And to show how much of a rhetorical trick it is, once you lose that sense of structuring of what's going on, you could see the politicians too as engaged in an act of resistance, or the policymakers. They're resisting the way in which citizens standardly respond to their policies. They're trying to present and shift citizens in a different world. They're resisting the world as it is and trying to drive it into a different direction. So there's a sense in which you could describe anyone as resisting, including the people producing the policies, if you want, right? And in that sense, what resistance is just a word for being empathetic to the way in which people draw on particular traditions to do what they do, right? And it just so happens that I'm able to use it in a way that gives it this nice rhetorical, more left-wing variance of rejecting bad stuff. But I could lose that. I could find a more neutral way of speaking that would retain the basic narrative. Law. I think that there's one way of thinking about law where law is a target or object of social science. So what we're trying to do is to understand what the law is and how it operates and why it operates as it does. If I treat the law like that, I think what I am, let's call that legal studies. I think what I am is a social scientist who happens to study the law. If that's how I treat law, I think that the way we should approach law is the way I approach every other act of governance, right? We should understand the law as something that arises out of meanings, it arises out of forms of expertise, slightly different forms of expertise, obviously, particularly often more normative forms of expertise, or more explicitly normative forms of expertise, because part of what I'm suggesting is that forms of social science are implicitly always normative. They drive us towards markets or networks as policies. But it arises out of forms of knowledge, forms of expertise that should be deconstructed and that meet resistance from practicing lawyers who make unexpected judges who make unexpected decisions, meet resistance from the police who often don't really, it's often a misnomer to see the police as applying the law. We do that, but if you ever do ethnographic work on police, most of the time they're using it as a guide and working with it. So they're often quite resistant to actually treating the law as it's meant to be treated, which is quite interesting. The people who are meant to be enforcing the law are, in a sense, resisting it, right? So you would end up doing exactly the same thing. Where I think the law becomes different, and this is how it's often taught in law schools to law students, is if we switch from that idea to law as a normative enterprise, where we're not trying to describe the world at all. What we're trying to say is what laws should govern society, right? And we might not want to phrase it quite that abstractly and quite that philosophically where it moves straight into jurisprudence. We might phrase it more as, how should we interpret this law? But often that itself is an issue of how do we want to interpret this law so that it makes sense of how we should govern society. So the same normative issues are erased, right? So law often has this normative, is often treated, we're often not treating law as an object of study. Instead, we're treating law as an extension of moral philosophy. And at that point, the talk would be completely different, because it would be about what are our normative values? How can I justify my normative values? Can I get you to agree with them? What are their implications for law? Right? And that would then, I think, look completely and utterly different as a talk. And then, thank you. Yep. So I'll just say quickly what I think you're saying, just to set up what I want to say in response to it, which is that that in principle it's possible that everyone could act differently. And obviously there's a sense in which, yes, absolutely, that's exactly what I'm saying. Indeed, I'm sort of saying everyone does act differently. We can cluster them together. But we can't cluster them together because this group has a unique property that makes it inevitable that they're going to behave in a way X. So that's very insightful, that's correct. And then you worry that means that we can't have any knowledge or order whatsoever, which is, again, a reasonable worry. You'll remember I said about the way in which I think that first as to summarize something I said earlier, first, as God disappears from the world, you get positivism of the form that Auguste Comte offers, where science is going to save the world and we're going to move to a technocratic order. And that then feeds into social science. It's a way of giving us a control over something that looks otherwise a bit ugly, messy, I think, is still my preferred word, right? So I can understand this. I can understand a worry about we don't have control. I have two responses to that worry. Apart from to just say, yeah, isn't that great? Because I'm a British New Lefty and leaning anarchist in my background, so yeah, great. Right? But apart from just say, yes, great, welcome to a much more interesting world where there isn't these established patterns. Apart from those sort of facile answers, I have two more serious answers. The first is, I'm not really saying we should just reject these forms of knowledge. What I'm saying is we should use them as heuristics, just like we do my packing list, to muddle through in daily life, to navigate patterns that we find. We just shouldn't imagine that those patterns are somehow structured into the world in the way that H2O is structured into the world as water, right? That's not how social life is, right? So on the one hand, I'm saying these are much looser, they're heuristics we can use to muddle through, but they don't give us certainties. But muddling through is okay. It's what we do most of the time, right? I mean, I had, again, probably far too much personal information for you, But I had an awful time when I landed on Mexico because I tried to get money out with my debit card. And I failed, possibly a mistake I made, but I don't think so, the first 2 times. So then I was paranoid that the bank would take away my debit card. I hadn't got any rules for how to behave with that, so I sort of muddle through. I say to my wife, what should I do? I'm texting her. I ring up the bank. I think they're pretty useless, actually, with hindsight. And eventually, I won't tell you exactly what went on, but you try and find a way of muddling through and making it okay. And you've got little heuristics and established patterns that you fall back on. And that's what we do in life. And yeah, if you've got a certain notion of certainty, which you've inherited throughout your career for 30, 40 years, that loose way of muddling through can be pretty scary. But if I remind you that actually that's what you do all the time, hopefully it doesn't seem quite so scary. So that's my first answer. My second answer is rather different, but I think compatible. I was talking last night about the way in which I think part of what we should do in theory is try to link speculatively our theoretical ideas to other things we hold true, look for synergies in the way in which things work. And that's what I want to do here. And I want to suggest a synergy between what I'm talking about and things that I think. Notice, actually, before I go on, notice how I'm often saying I think or we, right? Part of what I'm trying to do is create a we here, where it's not that I have expertise and I'm imparting it to you. What I'm trying to do is say, look, we know this, don't we? We feel that. This is a common experience of us, isn't it? I'm not trying to bludgeon you into agreement by my brilliant data, right, or my powerful model. I'm trying to get you to say, yeah, this is part of our shared experience. It makes sense to us, right? Okay. So my second answer to it's a scary world out there, apart from no, it isn't. It's the world we all live in and do fine in every day. My second answer is, well, why is that so? Why is it that we all live in this world of heuristics muddling through every day and yet it all works out fine, right? Why is that so? Why is it? Because you're suggesting that, you know, if we don't have the order of social science, everything's going to collapse. And I'm saying, no, that's not what happens. We all know that's not what happens. We all know that in daily life, if we muddle through and find workable solutions and we adapt when things don't quite work out, it's sort of okay, right? That's what we do all the time. So why is that so? Why is that the human experience, right? And my speculative answer, and I'm all for theoretical speculation. I will defend it until I'm blue in the face. I think it's a brilliant thing to go in for. My speculative answer is that in a different sense of the word structure, there are deep structures to human life, that we're all biological organisms with similar evolutionary inheritances, living in a similar physical world. And that basic evolutionary biological fact about human life creates an awful lot of shared, you know, although you can't point to it and say we're bound to be like this, what it does is to create a basis that we sort of more or less take for granted and sort of move through, and that sort of makes things okay. So if I see someone crying, 9 times out of 10, I'll assume they're probably a bit upset. That's just a physical fact about humans, right? And it helps us to navigate our interactions with people, right? So there's something about our biology, something about our biology and the world we live in, right? Which stabilizes the world around us. And it's not that we're absolutely certain about things, but it gives a certain stability to a range of assumptions that means our muddling through the mess, it's not crazy, right? It generally does sort of work out okay, right? By and large, if you eat reasonably healthy, you will do better than if you don't. Of course, you might die of cancer when you're 35 anyway, but it's still, you know, probably a better idea to do that. No certainty about it, but, you know, yeah, not a bad idea because that's the way our biology works. Right? And so I think there's something about being human in the world that ought to give us a great deal of reassurance. But, final comment, but I'm going to try and drive you all, having said I'm trying to create a we, I'm now going to try and alienate you all by making you all good atheists. But I think we struggle to accept something like this biology is okay and we can muddle through on the base of it because we live in such a Judeo-Christian world. And that means that we're constantly seeking something that looks like or apes transcendental knowledge of profound divine truths which are present in the world. And we used to think theology gave us that, and as we drifted towards a secular world, positivism was meant to give us that, or Marxism was meant to give us that, and now modernist social sciences, right? And I think that therefore, that when getting back to something Carlos mentioned about how it can seem, I can't remember your word, Carlos, but how it seems very unusual to us, or it seems, I think it does in part because not only are we all social scientists in this room, but let's go for 99% of us or 95% of us grew up in heavily Judeo-Christian societies. And I think if I gave the same talk with the same metaphysical basis in China or in India, it wouldn't seem anything like as uncongenial or awkward. So it's not just the modernist social science, it's also our deep religious cultural roots that I think drive us towards wanting these forms of knowledge.
Pues muchas gracias por todas las preguntas y las participaciones. Con esto damos cierre a esta primera pues, actividad de las jornadas con el ciclo que tenemos ahora de ponencias. Las invitamos a tomar un café y en breve regresar aquí a la sala.